the last Apache widow on the auction block, until a rancher paid to set her free. The sun rose slowly over the dry plains, casting long shadows across the small frontier town. Dust swirled in the early morning air, carried by the cold wind that whispered through the wooden buildings. In the center of the town, a gathering had begun, unusual for the quiet, struggling settlement. People were coming together not for a celebration, but for something grim, a sight that no one could ignore. Today, the last Apache widow would be put on the auction block, and everyone had come to watch. Her name was Nayeli, and though her clothes were simple, her presence demanded attention. She stood tall, even in the face of sorrow and uncertainty, her dark hair pulled back neatly and her eyes reflecting both grief and strength. She had lost her husband in a raid months before, a man who had been her companion, protector, and the father of her only daughter, little Ayana. Now, without him, the world seemed harsher, colder, and unkind. Nayeli's people had been forced into hiding and scattering over the years, and she had survived countless hardships, yet nothing had prepared her for this moment. Standing in the center of the town, facing strangers who saw her not as a human being but as property. The wooden platform where she was to stand creaked under her weight. Her heart thumped as she glanced around. Townsfolk had gathered in a loose circle, whispering among themselves. Some faces showed curiosity, others greed, and a few held silent pity. The children of the town, wide-eyed and unsure, clung to their parents, learning a harsh lesson about the world they were growing up in. Men in hats and dust-stained coats adjusted their belts, sharpening their knives or checking their guns, though none dared speak to her yet. It was a cruel tradition, a system built on fear and survival, and Nayeli felt every bit the weight of it pressing on her chest. Her mind drifted back to her husband, Take, whose laughter and soft words had once filled her home with warmth. She remembered the nights they had spent under the open sky, teaching Ayana to count the stars, listening to the distant sounds of coyotes and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Take had always spoken of freedom, of living with dignity, of protecting their people even when the world seemed determined to take it all away. Now without him, Nayeli felt the fragility of life more sharply than ever. The auctioneer stepped onto the platform, a tall man with a booming voice that could carry over the chatter of the crowd. He cleared his throat and a hush fell over the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we present the last of her kind. A widow strong and proud, but now without a protector. Let the auction begin." His words were cold, mechanical, as if he were selling sacks of grain rather than a human being. Nayeli swallowed hard, keeping her expression calm. She would not let them see her fear. Not yet. The first bids were called. A few of the townsmen raised their hands, shouting numbers and offers. Nayeli's stomach tightened with each call, a mix of dread and disbelief swirling inside her. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the comments about her beauty, her strength, her quiet dignity. Some called her proud, others stubborn, and a few whispered that she would be difficult to control. She knew she was being measured, weighed, and valued in ways that had nothing to do with her heart or her courage. Little Ayana clung to her mother's skirt, her small hands trembling. The girl had watched her father die months ago, and now she faced the prospect of being taken from her home, from the memory of her father, and from the few people who still cared for them. Nayeli knelt slightly to meet her daughter's eyes. "Stay close," she whispered. "No matter what happens, we will face it together." Ayana nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, and tightened her grip on her mother. As the auction continued, Nayeli observed the men bidding. One was a wealthy rancher with a stern face and sharp eyes, focused more on numbers than on her presence. Another was younger, impatient, and seemed eager to take advantage of the situation. Yet another man, older and quieter, simply watched, as if trying to decide if he should intervene or stay out of it. Each bid reminded Nayeli that the world could be cruel and unforgiving, but it also showed her something else, that courage and dignity could stand even in the darkest moments. The heat of the day rose, and the sun burned down on the wooden platform. Nayeli shifted slightly, careful to maintain her composure. She thought about her people, the Apache tribes who had fought tirelessly to survive, who had taught her the importance of pride and resilience. She remembered the stories her mother had told her as a child, about ancestors who had faced impossible odds and yet never lost their spirit. Nayeli drew strength from those memories. She would not crumble. Not here, not now. A hush fell over the crowd when a small boy pointed toward Nayeli and whispered loudly enough for nearby adults to hear, "She looks so sad. Why are they selling her?" Some adults frowned, while others laughed. Nayeli's heart ached for the child's innocence. She wished she could explain to him the world's unfairness, but there was no time, no audience that would listen with understanding. She bent down slightly, whispering to Ayana, "Someday you will know why we endure. Someday you will understand strength." The auctioneer's voice rang out again, louder this time. "Going once." "Going twice." The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Nayeli felt a bead of sweat roll down her temple. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath, centering herself. Every auction, every bid, every stare of the crowd, she knew, was a test, not just of survival, but of spirit. And she would meet that test with everything she had. She could see the fear in some of the bidders' eyes, the greed in others, but there was also curiosity. Curiosity about the widow, about her strength, about what made her different from others who had been sold, taken, or lost. Nayeli did not speak. She let her silence speak for her, letting the weight of her presence, her grief, and her courage fill the space around her. She was more than an object for sale. She was a woman who had loved, lost, and endured. Minutes passed like hours. The sun climbed higher, and the crowd shifted, restless but unwilling to leave until the auction concluded. Nayeli's thoughts wandered to the future, to the uncertain path that awaited her. Would she survive this day? Would she and her daughter find safety? She refused to dwell on despair for long, focusing instead on small victories. The steady rhythm of her breathing, the quiet dignity in her stance, the calm in her eyes despite the storm around her. As the auctioneer prepared to call the next round of bids, Nayeli noticed a man at the edge of the crowd, quiet and watchful. Unlike the others, he did not shout, wave, or display impatience. He simply observed. There was something in his eyes, a sense of respect, of understanding, perhaps even kindness. Nayeli could not be sure, but for a brief moment she felt a flicker of hope. The crowd's murmurs rose again, and the auction continued, but Nayeli's mind remained steady. She focused on the sound of her daughter's small hands clinging to hers, on the strength in her own heart, and on the knowledge that even in the harshest times, courage could prevail. She would not give up. She could not. For Ayana, for herself, for the memory of her husband, she would endure. The day wore on, the heat pressing down, the dust swirling, and the voices of the crowd growing louder. Yet Nayeli remained calm, resolute, and unbroken. Each bid, each call, each stare of curiosity or greed only strengthened her resolve. She was more than the sum of the offers made for her. She was a widow, a mother, a survivor. And though the world around her seemed determined to crush her spirit, she carried within her the legacy of her people, a legacy of endurance, courage, and dignity that no auction block could ever take away. By the end of the morning, Nayeli had faced the crowd, the bids, and the uncertainty with remarkable strength. She had shown, without a word, that her spirit could not be bought or sold. And though the auction had not yet concluded, something had shifted in the air. Some of the townsfolk began to see her differently, not as property, but as a person. Nayeli did not rejoice yet. She had survived many trials, and she knew this was only the beginning. But in her heart, a tiny seed of hope had taken root, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, freedom might find her before the day was done. The auctioneer's voice rang through the dry morning air, sharp and relentless. Going once. Going twice. Each word seemed to tighten the knot in Nayeli's chest. Her hands stayed clasped in front of her, fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the tension of the moment. Around her, the crowd shifted, murmuring in anticipation. The townspeople leaned in, eager to see who would take the widow, who would claim her life as if it were an object to own. Nayeli's dark eyes scanned the faces, reading the greed, the curiosity, and occasionally the flicker of hesitation. She tried not to focus on the numbers the offers shouted across the dusty square. Each bid was more than just a sum of money. It was a measure of how others valued her, how little regard they had for the life she had lived, for the love she had given, for the child who clung to her side. Nayeli's gaze fell on Ayana, whose small eyes were wide with fear and confusion. The child did not fully understand what was happening, only that the world seemed dangerous, unpredictable, and cruel. Nayeli bent slightly to whisper, "Stay close, my little one. Whatever happens, I am here, always." The first man stepped forward to bid. He was a tall rancher, dressed in worn leather, with a sun-baked face and hands that looked like they had worked the land for decades. His voice was rough as he called out a number. Nayeli felt a chill run through her spine. The man's gaze was sharp, calculating, and she sensed the cold practicality in him. She knew men like this, strong, commanding, and accustomed to owning whatever they wanted. Yet there was something in his manner, a certain restraint, that made her pause. Unlike others, he did not leer or make crude gestures. He simply made his offer and then stepped back. Another man, younger and brash, called out a higher bid immediately. He smirked, looking at Nayeli as though she were a challenge to conquer. The auctioneer nodded and encouraged the next bids, the voices rising and falling like waves on a stormy sea. Nayeli's stomach tightened. She had survived the harshness of frontier life before, but this was different. This was a public display of power, a test of patience and endurance. She had no choice but to stand tall, even as her heart beat fiercely in her chest. As the bids continued, Nayeli noticed a few of the older townsfolk exchanging glances. They whispered quietly, too low for her to hear. She sensed their unease, perhaps the first sign that not everyone in the town agreed with this cruel practice. Nayeli had learned long ago that even small signs of compassion could be a lifeline. She clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, might see her as a human being rather than property. The heat of the day intensified. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the wooden platform and baking the dust into the skin of everyone present. Nayeli felt the sweat trickle down her back, but she did not flinch. Her thoughts drifted to the stories her mother had told her about Apache ancestors who had faced impossible odds and survived. They had endured wars, displacement, and loss, yet they had never surrendered their dignity. Nayeli reminded herself that she was carrying that same spirit forward, that she could stand tall even in the most trying circumstances. She glanced at Ayanna, who was clutching a small piece of cloth tied around her wrist, a keepsake from her father. Nayeli's heart ached at the sight, but she also felt a renewed sense of responsibility. She could not allow fear to dominate. She had to be strong, for herself and for her daughter. Her eyes swept across the crowd, taking in every gesture, every whisper, every leer. She would endure. She would survive. The auctioneer's voice cut sharply through the tension. "Do I have any more bids?" His eyes scanned the crowd, daring anyone to offer more. Nayeli's ears caught the sharp tones, the way some men laughed, some whispered, some muttered, their reluctance. She realized that fear was a tool here, wielded by those who wanted to intimidate, to assert dominance. Nayeli would not be intimidated. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and met the gazes of the bidders with quiet, unyielding resolve. A man from the back, older and quieter than the others, raised his hand tentatively. He did not call out a number. Instead, he simply watched. His eyes lingered on Nayeli, and she felt a curious sense of calm wash over her. Perhaps he remembered the stories of the Apache people, or perhaps he simply understood strength when he saw it. Nayeli could not be certain, but the brief spark of recognition reminded her that not all men were cruel, and not all hearts were hardened. As the auctioneer called for the next round of bids, Nayeli's thoughts turned inward. She thought about her husband, Take, who had taught her the value of courage, the importance of protecting those she loved, and the strength found in dignity. She remembered the nights under the stars, the stories of ancestors, the lessons of resilience. She felt a flicker of hope that somewhere beyond the crowd someone might come to her aid. The crowd's excitement grew. Some whispered that the widow's spirit was unyielding, that she would be difficult to claim. Others spoke of her beauty and strength as if her very presence increased the value of the auction. Nayeli heard these words, but she did not allow them to shake her resolve. She had faced ridicule, scorn, and violence before. She would endure this moment with the same grace that had carried her through countless hardships. Then, a new figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Unlike the others, he did not shout, wave, or act impatient. He was quiet, deliberate, and seemed to measure every step with care. Nayeli's eyes met his for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, a combination of respect and curiosity, that made her heart skip a beat. She could not know his intentions yet, but for the first time that morning she felt a small glimmer of hope. The auctioneer called for silence as the bids rose higher. The young, brash men continued to shout, their voices carrying across the dusty town square. Nayeli felt the weight of every stare, every expectation, every judgment, but she refused to break. She reminded herself that her spirit, her courage, and her dignity were hers alone. No amount of money, no cruel custom could take that away. Ayanna tugged at her mother's skirt, whispering, "Mama, will it be over soon?" Nayeli bent down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Soon, my love. Stay close to me and trust that we will find a way." The girl nodded, her small hands gripping her mother's tightly, and Nayeli felt a surge of determination. She would protect her child, even in the face of the harshest cruelty. The auctioneer's voice grew louder, calling for the final bids. Nayeli felt her pulse quicken. She knew this was a turning point, the moment that could decide their fate. She could sense the tension in the crowd, the anticipation of who would claim the widow and her child, and then she saw him, the quiet man at the edge of the square, watching with steady eyes. Unlike the others, he did not raise his hand immediately. He waited, silent, patient. Nayeli felt her heart lift slightly. Perhaps he understood that she was more than an object to buy. The brash young men shouted their final offers. Nayeli felt the air thick with tension, every heartbeat echoing in her ears. She glanced at Ayana, whose wide eyes reflected both fear and hope. The little girl's trust in her mother strengthened Nayeli's resolve. She would face whatever came, and she would do it with courage. Then, as the sun reached its highest point, the quiet man stepped forward. He raised his hand slowly, and the auctioneer's eyes widened in surprise. The man's voice was calm but firm. He placed a bid that was unexpected, a bid that silenced the crowd for a brief moment. Nayeli felt her heart leap. She could not yet believe it. Someone had chosen not to see her as property, but as a person. The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, others in curiosity. Nayeli stood taller, her spirit renewed. The auction continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The quiet man had introduced the possibility of something different, something better. Nayeli felt a spark of hope for the first time that morning. Perhaps freedom was not just a dream. Perhaps someone could offer her the chance to live with dignity once more. As the bidding reached its peak, Nayeli focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, on the steady heartbeat of courage within her chest. She looked at her daughter, at the small hands clinging to hers, and felt a surge of determination. No matter what happened, she would endure. She would survive. She would protect her child. The day stretched on, the sun beating down, the dust rising with each movement of the crowd. Nayeli remained steadfast, a beacon of courage and dignity in the midst of chaos. And though the auctioneer's voice continued to call out bids, a quiet tension had settled over the square. Everyone could sense that something was about to change, that the widow might not be claimed by the cruelest bidder, but perhaps by someone who saw her worth as a human being. For Nayeli, the long hours were filled with fear, hope, and quiet resilience. She had faced countless hardships, yet she stood here, unbroken, determined to protect herself and her daughter. The crowd might see her as an object, a commodity to trade, but Nayeli knew the truth of her own spirit. And as the sun blazed overhead, she felt that for the first time that morning the possibility of freedom was real, and that maybe, just maybe, her fate could be different. The sun hung high over the frontier town, the dusty square shimmering under its heat. Nayeli stood on the wooden platform, her hands steady, though her heart raced with a mix of fear and hope. The murmurs of the crowd had grown louder, their whispers and guesses blending with the creak of the platform under her feet. She kept her gaze forward, her chin lifted, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. Each look she received seemed to judge her, measure her, try to define her by what others wanted rather than who she was. Then she saw him again, the quiet man who had arrived at the edge of the crowd. Unlike the others, he did not shout or wave for attention. He stood tall, strong, and calm, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart stir. Nayeli could not read his mind, but there was something different about him. She sensed respect in his gaze, a recognition of her dignity, and perhaps a glimmer of compassion. In a moment like this, such a look could feel like a lifeline, and for Nayeli it did. The auctioneer, sensing the rising tension in the crowd, raised his voice. "Any more bids? Any more offers for the widow?" His tone carried the impatience of a man who had seen such scenes many times before. But this time the crowd's energy had shifted. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as if the people themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Nayeli's hands tightened slightly in front of her, and she stole a quick glance at Ayana. The little girl's wide eyes mirrored both fear and a fragile hope. Nayeli whispered under her breath, "Stay close, my love. Soon we will see what must be done." The first few bids were called again, higher than before. Some men shouted, eager to claim her, their voices rough and filled with greed. Others murmured, unsure whether to compete with the strong rancher who had already made his move. Nayeli felt each word, each number, as if it were a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She remained calm, her breathing measured, keeping herself anchored in the strength she had drawn from years of survival and the memory of her husband, Take. Finally, the quiet rancher stepped forward. His movements were deliberate and calm, as if he understood the gravity of the moment more than anyone else. He raised his hand, and the auctioneer's eyes immediately shifted to him. "A bid," the man called, his voice steady, "of $500. The square fell silent for a heartbeat. $500 was more than anyone had expected, enough to surpass all previous offers. The crowd exchanged stunned looks. Some muttered under their breath, others shook their heads in disbelief. Nayeli's pulse quickened. She could not yet comprehend what this meant. Was it enough to change her fate? The auctioneer's eyes flicked between the bidders, his voice rising. "Do I hear more?" "Going once? Going twice?" The brash young men hesitated, then shouted higher bids. Their voices cracked in their eagerness, revealing impatience and frustration. But the rancher did not back down. His voice rang out clear and firm, $600, for the widow and her child. She shall not be claimed by anyone else. Nayeli's breath caught in her throat. The words, simple as they were, carried a weight she had not expected. Someone had chosen to protect her, not for greed or power, but perhaps for justice, perhaps for decency. Her heart fluttered in disbelief, hope mingling with cautious caution. She could not yet trust the world, not after the cruelty she had seen, but for the first time that morning she dared to believe that freedom might be possible. The crowd's murmurs rose again. Some men were angry, their pride wounded by the unexpected bid. Others watched silently, sensing that this auction might end differently than they had anticipated. Nayeli, standing tall, felt a strange calmness settle over her. She knew that whatever happened next, she had done her part. She had survived, stood strong, and refused to allow fear to consume her. Now, the outcome rested in the hands of this stranger, and she could only hope his intentions were true. The auctioneer called for silence, raising his hand as he prepared to close the bidding. "Final bids. Any more offers?" He scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp, but none dared challenge the calm rancher. The square was tense, every breath held, every eye fixed on Nayeli and the man who had stepped forward. Then, with a firm nod, the auctioneer declared, "Sold. To the gentleman for $600. A hush fell over the crowd. Nayeli felt the tension drain from her body, replaced by a fragile, trembling relief. She had been freed, purchased not to be owned, but to be protected. Her eyes widened as she met the rancher's gaze. There was a strength in him, a seriousness that reassured her, and perhaps even a hint of kindness. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Nayeli felt the possibility of safety, of hope, and of a future not dictated by cruelty or chance. The rancher stepped forward, approaching the platform with deliberate care. Nayeli could feel the weight of the town's eyes on her, but she focused solely on the man in front of her. He extended a hand, not to claim her, but to guide her down from the wooden platform. She took it cautiously, feeling the rough warmth of his grip, the steadiness that spoke of experience and trustworthiness. With a gentle nod, he said, "You and your daughter are safe now. I will see that no harm comes to you." Nayeli blinked, tears threatening to spill. The words, so simple, felt like a balm on the ache that had been building in her chest for months. She looked at Ayanna, who clung to her mother, and whispered, "See, my love? Freedom is here." The little girl's eyes reflected astonishment and relief. Nayeli realized that this man had given her more than safety. He had given her the chance to rebuild, to reclaim her life, and to protect her child from the harshness of the world. The townspeople began to disperse slowly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others muttering quietly to themselves. The auction was over, but its echoes would linger for many days. Nayeli descended from the platform, holding Ayanna close, her eyes never leaving the rancher. She could sense the seriousness in his movements, the careful thought in his eyes. She did not know him well yet, but she felt a spark of trust. He had acted not out of greed, not out of cruelty, but out of a sense of decency that she had long feared the world had forgotten. The rancher guided them toward his horse-drawn wagon at the edge of the town. Nayeli noticed the simplicity of his approach. No flashy gestures, no words to boast. He simply offered safety and a promise, a rare kindness in a world that had offered her little else. As they began the short journey out of town, Nayeli felt the wind in her hair, the dust settling behind them, and a sense of cautious hope rising in her chest. She thought of her husband Taki and the life they had shared. She thought of the nights under the stars, the lessons of her people, and the strength that had been passed down through generations. Nayeli realized that this moment, while unexpected, was not purely luck. It was the result of endurance, courage, and the refusal to surrender to despair. She had survived the auction, and now she had the chance to live freely, to protect her child, and to reclaim the dignity that had been threatened. As they rode, Nayeli spoke softly to Ayanna. "We are free now, my love. We will find a new home, a place where we can be safe." The little girl nodded, her small hands clutching her mother's tightly. Nayeli felt a surge of determination. She would teach Ayana the ways of their people, the lessons of courage, and the importance of resilience. They had endured much, but this was the first step toward a new beginning. The rancher, who had introduced himself simply as Jeremiah, did not speak much during the journey. His silence was not cold, but measured, a reflection of his respect for Nayeli and her daughter. He guided the wagon carefully over the uneven terrain, ensuring their safety while allowing them space to adjust to the sudden shift in their lives. Nayeli appreciated his quiet approach. Words were not always necessary to show trust, kindness, or understanding. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the plains, Nayeli had begun to feel the weight of her relief. The auction, the cruel tradition, and the uncertainty were behind them. For the first time, she could breathe without the constant pressure of fear pressing on her chest. She glanced at Jeremiah, seeing the determination in his eyes, the commitment to ensure their safety. In that moment, Nayeli understood that their journey had just begun, but the path forward was no longer dictated by cruelty or oppression. As they continued, the plains stretched endlessly before them, a symbol of both challenge and opportunity. Nayeli felt a flicker of excitement mixed with caution. She knew that life on the frontier would never be easy, that obstacles would arise, and that they would have to rely on courage, resilience, and trust in each other. But for now, the immediate danger had passed, and the first threads of hope were taking root in her heart. Nayeli held Ayana close, whispering stories of their ancestors, tales of bravery, and lessons of endurance. She reminded herself that even in the harshest conditions, the spirit could prevail. The auction had tested her, but she had emerged stronger, guided by the kindness of a man who had chosen decency over greed. And though the future was uncertain, for the first time in a long while, Nayeli allowed herself to believe in it, to see a path forward, and to imagine a life where she and her daughter could be safe, respected, and free. The wagon rattled over the uneven trail, carrying Nayeli, little Ayana, and Jeremiah away from the town that had almost claimed their freedom. The plains stretched endlessly, bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, the distant sound of birds, and the faint whisper of a world untouched by cruelty. Nayeli watched the horizon carefully, her eyes alert for danger, but her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time she felt the faint stirrings of hope. Ayana, exhausted from the tension of the auction, leaned against her mother. Her small hands clutched the cloth tied to her wrist, a keepsake from her father. Nayeli gently brushed the hair from her daughter's face and whispered, "We are safe now." "You will see, my love. We will find a home where no one can hurt us." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. Nayeli smiled softly, grateful for her child's quiet courage. Even in fear, Ayana had stayed close, drawing strength from her mother's calm. Jeremiah, quiet and steady, guided the wagon carefully. He did not speak much, but his presence was reassuring. There was an unspoken understanding between them. He had given them freedom, but he would also give them the space to adjust. Nayeli sensed that he did not wish to intrude on their grief or impose on their lives. He understood that trust could not be forced. It had to grow, slowly, through deeds and respect. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plains, Jeremiah pointed toward a cluster of trees in the distance. "We'll stop there for the night," he said. "There's water, and it's sheltered. You and your daughter can rest before we move on to the ranch in the morning." His voice was calm yet firm. Nayeli nodded, silently grateful for his thoughtfulness. Even small gestures, she knew, mattered more than words. When they reached the shelter of the trees, Nayeli helped Ayana down from the wagon. The little girl's legs were tired, and she leaned heavily on her mother. They walked slowly toward the shade, feeling the relief of soft grass beneath their feet for the first time in weeks. Nayeli took a deep breath, letting the scent of the land fill her senses. For so long, her life had been filled with fear and loss. Now she could feel the first gentle threads of peace. Jeremiah arranged a small fire nearby, careful not to intrude on their space. Nayeli watched him work, noting the careful attention he gave to safety and comfort. She could see that he understood the needs of those who had been through trauma, that he knew freedom was not only physical but emotional. Nayeli felt a cautious admiration for the man, a sense of trust slowly growing alongside the relief that she and Ayana were no longer at the mercy of the cruel world. As night fell, the stars began to appear, twinkling like tiny sparks over the plains. Nayeli and Ayana sat close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, sharing quiet moments together. Nayeli spoke softly to her daughter, telling stories of their ancestors, of brave Apache women who had endured hardships yet never lost their courage. She spoke of Take, her husband, his strength, his love, and the lessons he had passed down. Ayana listened intently, her small eyes reflecting the dancing flames, learning both courage and hope. Jeremiah kept a respectful distance, tending to the fire and the horses. His presence was reassuring but unobtrusive. Nayeli observed him quietly, noting the care in his movements, the patience in his gaze. He had not claimed them, forced them, or demanded their gratitude. Instead, he had acted with thoughtfulness and respect, giving them a choice, and that choice was the beginning of trust. Nayeli felt the first warmth of gratitude. Not the shallow kind, but deep, quiet appreciation for a man who had understood the value of freedom. The next morning, sunlight poured through the trees, painting the land in soft gold. Nayeli helped Ayana wash in the nearby stream, the cold water refreshing and cleansing after the tension and fear of the auction. The little girl laughed softly as the water ran over her hands, and Nayeli smiled, feeling a flicker of happiness that had been absent for too long. She realized that moments like these, simple and ordinary, were powerful. They marked the beginning of a life not defined by fear, but by the possibility of joy. Jeremiah prepared breakfast, cooking over the small fire. The smell of warm bread and roasted meat filled the air. Nayeli watched silently, grateful that he had taken the time to provide for them. The simple act of kindness reinforced her growing sense of trust. She understood that freedom was not only the absence of danger, but the presence of care, and Jeremiah was showing them both. After breakfast, they continued their journey toward the ranch. Nayeli observed the land around them, noting the rolling plains, scattered trees, and distant mountains. She felt a connection to the land, a sense of possibility and growth. Life here would not be easy. She knew the frontier demanded hard work and resilience. But the difference now was that she had a choice, a guide, and a protector who respected her. She could plan, act, and teach her daughter in a world that no longer threatened to take everything from them. Along the way, Nayeli learned more about Jeremiah. He was a man who had built the ranch from nothing, who had faced hardships of his own, yet he had not allowed them to harden his heart. He spoke little, but his words were thoughtful, his guidance steady. Nayeli recognized that trust would not come instantly, but it was growing through actions, patience, and respect. She began to feel a cautious optimism, the realization that life could be different, that the future could hold safety, stability, and even happiness. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set. The wide field stretched before them, dotted with fences, grazing animals, and a modest but sturdy house. Nayeli felt a mixture of awe and relief. This would be their new home, a place where she could protect Ayana, teach her the ways of their people, and rebuild a life that had been threatened by cruelty and loss. Jeremiah helped them settle in, showing them the small cabin they would occupy, the pasture for the animals, and the nearby stream for water. Every detail was practical but thoughtful, designed to give them comfort and security. Nayeli and Ayana explored their new space slowly. The cabin was simple but warm and safe. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were sturdy. Nayeli imagined decorating the small space with memories of Take, with symbols of their people, and with reminders of their resilience. She wanted Ayana to feel both safety and pride, to learn that even in hardship, life could offer security, dignity, and moments of joy. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Nayeli reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The auction, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had tested her spirit. But now, surrounded by the warmth of the cabin, the trust-building presence of Jeremiah, and the quiet laughter of her daughter, she felt the first sense of possibility. Life on the ranch would be hard, filled with work and learning, but it would be theirs. They would survive, adapt, and thrive, guided by courage and trust. Jeremiah joined them by the fire, sitting quietly, giving them space but remaining near. Nayeli looked at him and spoke softly. "Thank you for giving us a chance. I will not forget it." He nodded, his eyes steady and calm, a silent promise that his protection and respect were genuine. Nayeli felt a deep sense of relief, understanding that kindness and decency still existed, even in a harsh world. Over the next days, Nayeli began learning the rhythms of ranch life. She helped Ayana care for small animals, gather firewood, and fetch water. Each task, though simple, was a lesson in resilience and patience. She taught her daughter to respect the land, to understand its dangers, and to recognize its gifts. Ayana adapted quickly, her laughter and curiosity bringing light to the cabin and filling Nayeli's heart with renewed hope. Jeremiah guided them through the work without commanding, offering advice and support when needed, and Nayeli appreciated his approach, which allowed her to maintain dignity while learning new skills. She began to see him not only as a protector but as a partner in their survival, a man who understood the value of respect, patience, and trust. Slowly, walls began to crumble, and a bond, quiet but strong, began to grow. As the weeks passed, the trio settled into a routine. Mornings were filled with chores, afternoons with lessons and exploration, and evenings by the fire, sharing stories of the past and hopes for the future. Nayeli began to feel a sense of peace that had long been absent, a realization that freedom was not only the absence of danger but the presence of trust, care, and opportunity. She had survived the auction, and now, in this new life, she would teach Ayana how to thrive. Nayeli looked out over the fields one evening, the sun setting in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The land stretched endlessly, full of promise and challenge. She felt the weight of her past lessen, replaced by determination and hope. They had endured much, but now, with trust, courage, and care, they could begin again. And in the quiet strength of that moment, Nayeli understood that life, even after the harshest trials, could hold safety, dignity, and the first glimmers of happiness. The morning sun rose over the wide plains, painting the fields in soft gold. Nayeli stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out at the land that stretched endlessly before her. The air smelled of fresh grass and earth, carrying the faint sound of animals grazing in the distance. She felt the gentle warmth on her face, a sensation she had not experienced fully in months. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the quiet joy of safety. The auction, the fear, and the uncertainty were behind them now. Here, on this land, she could breathe without constant worry. Little Ayana ran ahead, her laughter bright and clear. She chased a small flock of chickens, her hands waving as she called to the birds. Nayeli watched her daughter's freedom and happiness and felt a deep sense of pride. The child's laughter was a music Nayeli had feared she would never hear again. Every smile, every movement, every innocent curiosity reminded Nayeli of the life she had fought to protect and the promise of a future they could now shape together. Jeremiah emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket of water. His movements were steady, calm, and unhurried. He set the bucket down and looked toward Nayeli and Ayana with a quiet smile. "The chickens will settle soon," he said. "Don't worry, little one. You have time to explore and play." His tone was gentle, a balance of authority and care. Nayeli felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had rescued them from the auction block. His kindness had been more than a single act. It had become the foundation of trust that allowed her to rebuild her life. Nayeli approached Jeremiah slowly, her hands brushing over the folds of her simple dress. "I still can't believe it," she said softly. "After everything we endured, you gave us a chance." Jeremiah's eyes met hers, steady and sincere. "You deserved it," he replied simply. "No one should be sold like that. No one should lose hope in a world that can be cruel. I did what I thought was right." His words carried no arrogance, only a quiet strength that made Nayeli feel both relief and respect. They walked together toward the cabin, where Ayana had now settled, watching the chickens peck the ground. Nayeli felt the warmth of the early morning sun on her back, and with each step, the weight of fear that had clung to her heart for so long lifted slightly. She realized that freedom was not only about escaping danger, it was about the chance to live with dignity, to teach her daughter courage, and to build a life that reflected both resilience and hope. As the days passed, life on the ranch became a rhythm. Nayeli learned to care for the animals, tend to the land, and prepare meals. Ayana followed her mother, learning quickly, her small hands mimicking Nayeli's movements. Jeremiah guided them gently, offering advice without imposing, allowing them to maintain dignity while learning new skills. Each task, no matter how simple, became a lesson in survival, patience, and cooperation. Nayeli felt the quiet satisfaction of accomplishment, the joy of seeing her daughter learn and adapt, and the growing sense of safety that came with daily routines. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant mountains, Nayeli and Ayana sat by the fire roasting small pieces of meat and bread. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. Nayeli glanced at her daughter, who was quietly nibbling her food, eyes bright and content. She felt a warmth in her chest she had not known in months, a mix of relief, pride, and cautious hope. For the first time, Nayeli allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by fear, cruelty, or loss. Jeremiah joined them at the fire, setting down a small cup of water for Nayeli. She accepted it with a nod, grateful not only for the drink, but for the presence of someone who cared without asking for repayment. They sat in quiet companionship, the crackling of the fire and the gentle sounds of the ranch surrounding them. Nayeli realized that trust had been built not through words alone, but through consistent, thoughtful action. Jeremiah had shown her that freedom could coexist with safety, respect, and even kindness. In the weeks that followed, Nayeli began teaching Ayanna about their Apache heritage. She told stories of their ancestors, of brave women who had endured hardship yet never surrendered their dignity. She taught her daughter songs, simple lessons about courage, and the importance of respecting the land. Ayanna listened intently, absorbing every word, her eyes reflecting admiration for the strength and resilience of her mother. Nayeli knew that these lessons would shape the child's character, giving her the tools to navigate a world that could still be harsh but also full of possibility. Jeremiah observed quietly, never interrupting, never imposing, but always present. Nayeli appreciated his approach, which respected her role as a mother and teacher. Over time, she realized that his presence was more than protection. It was partnership. He did not seek control, nor did he expect gratitude in words. Instead, he acted with consistency, reliability, and respect, teaching her and Ayanna that safety and kindness could exist even in a rugged, unpredictable world. As the seasons changed, the ranch became a home. The fields grew green in spring, the streams swelled with rain, and the animals thrived under their care. Nayeli found strength in routine, in the small victories of daily life, and in the laughter and curiosity of Ayanna. Each day she felt more grounded, more connected to the land and to the life they were building. She understood that survival was only the beginning. Now came the work of creating a life filled with dignity, hope, and joy. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Nayeli stood outside the cabin with Ayanna, looking up at the vast expanse above. She pointed to the constellations, recalling the lessons Taka had taught her about the stars. "Each one tells a story," she said softly. "Our people, our ancestors, they are watching, guiding us. Remember that courage and honor are never forgotten, even in the darkest times." Ayanna nodded, eyes wide, absorbing the wisdom and comfort in her mother's words. Jeremiah approached quietly, standing a respectful distance away. "They will guide you," he said. "And so will the land. You've endured much, Nayeli, but you are stronger than the hardships you faced. Your daughter is lucky to have you." Nayeli felt a warmth in her chest at his words, not because of flattery, but because they were genuine, spoken with respect and understanding. She realized that trust and gratitude could coexist, and that human kindness, even in small acts, could change the course of life. The months passed, and Nayeli and Ayanna continued to thrive. The land provided sustenance, the animals brought responsibility and joy, and Jeremiah remained a steady presence. Life on the ranch was not easy. It required work, patience, and resilience. But for the first time, Nayeli felt that her choices mattered, that her actions could protect and nurture her daughter, and that the horrors of the past did not have to define their future. One morning, as they tended the fields, Nayeli felt a quiet satisfaction. The sun warmed her face, the wind whispered through the grass, and the distant mountains stood like silent guardians. She looked at Ayanna, who was learning to herd the smaller animals, and felt a profound sense of hope. The little girl's laughter and determination reminded Nayeli that life, even after unimaginable hardship, could be full of promise. Jeremiah approached, holding a basket of fresh eggs. You've done well," he said, his voice calm and steady. Nayeli smiled, understanding that these words were more than a simple compliment. They were a recognition of strength, resilience, and the ability to endure. In that moment, Nayeli felt a connection not only to the land and her daughter, but also to the man who had given them a chance at life. His presence was a reminder that courage, trust, and kindness could exist even in the harshest of worlds. As the sun set over the plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Nayeli sat with Ayanna by the fire. The little girl rested her head against her mother's shoulder, content and safe. Nayeli felt a deep sense of fulfillment and peace. They had endured fear, loss, and uncertainty, but now they had freedom, safety, and the possibility of happiness. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had arrived at a place of hope and new beginnings. Nayeli thought of Taki, her husband, and the life they had shared. Though he was gone, his lessons and love lived on in her heart and in Ayanna. She realized that true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it with courage, dignity, and resilience. Their journey had been shaped by both tragedy and kindness, and now, in this quiet moment, she understood that life could be reclaimed, rebuilt, and cherished. Jeremiah joined them by the fire, the quiet strength in his presence offering reassurance. Nayeli looked at him and nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving us a chance, for showing that life can be kind." He smiled faintly, the lines of hardship and experience on his face softening. "It was the right thing to do," he replied simply. You've earned this chance with your courage and strength. Now it's time to live it." As the night deepened and the stars sparkled above, Nayeli felt a profound sense of peace. The auction, the fear, and the cruelty of the past were behind them. Ayana slept peacefully, safe in her mother's arms. The land stretched endlessly around them, full of promise and quiet beauty. Nayeli understood that life would still have challenges, but for the first time, she believed in a future filled with hope, dignity, and safety. In the stillness of the night, Nayeli whispered softly to herself and to her daughter, "We are free. We will endure. We will live." And with those words, she closed her eyes, heart full of hope, knowing that a new beginning had finally arrived, a beginning forged through courage, trust, and the unyielding human spirit.